Greetings in Italian, which is the official language of the university, just per salutare tutti coloro che sono qui questa sera, in particolare i nostri ospiti che parteciperanno alla tavola rotonda organizzata dalla professoressa Hannawa, in particolare Sir Liam Donaldson, che ci fa l'onore di essere qui questa sera e che certamente è il nostro guest of honor. Tutti coloro che partecipano alla tavola rotonda, che immagino saranno presentati più particolarmente ulteriormente. Mi fa piacere salutare la direzione dell'EOC, il direttore generale Pellanda, il presidente Paolo Sanvido, il direttore Luca Ilmoni, i colleghi, e sono contento che ci siano anche un certo numero di persone. Penso che si possa dire che aspettavamo un po' più di pubblico, visto l'interesse del soggetto, ma e adesso passo in inglese, così che anche i nostri ospiti possano seguire senza la traduzione. So, I'm glad that this event takes place here at l'Università della Svizzera Italiana. As probably most of you know, we have started a faculty in biomedicine a couple of years ago, and but we're not actually offering courses yet. There are two research institutes that are already very active in biomedicine, but we also would like to stress and show that at Università della Svizzera Italiana we are developing and caring about health in general. So it's not just medicine, but health in general. And in a sense, I mean, it seems to me that the topic for tonight is somewhere in between what is considered public health in general and medicine, because it's about the health of patients, but not in the sense that you're taking care of patients according to the standard protocols, I guess, you know, because you're taking care of their diseases, illnesses, sufferings, but because it turns out that hospitals are a liability, apparently, are a dangerous place. And as has been pointed out in one of the flyers presenting this event, well, when you hop onto an airplane, into a car, where you take into account the risks related to the trips that you're going to make, you're instructed on what to do in case there is a problem. And it is certainly true that normally when you go into a hospital, you don't think about the fact that there might be more problems than the ones you actually have that actually brought you there as a patient. Now, I won't go into the numbers, which I guess will be recalled in more detail later on. The figures are actually quite amazing, and there is something to do to improve patient safety. So this is definitely a very important topic, and there is still an effort to be sustained, I guess, for quite a while to improve those statistics, one may say, unfortunately. And it's a great honor to have Sir Liam Donaldson here with us tonight, who actually initiated the effort on the right scale, I guess, to have this topic have an impact even locally. And so I'm quite confident that something concrete will come out of the efforts. I shouldn't say initiated tonight, because I'm pretty sure that the ente ospedaliero is already quite active in this regard. And in fact, mentioning the ente ospedaliero, I would like to stress that another reason for being happy that this event is actually through the doctors that are now professors at the university, but also along this line and also, I mean, it is mentioned somewhere, it will certainly come out at some point. One of the participants is actually in charge of the nursing sector in the hospital. Another thing that we would like to develop, which is not the case in most medical training, is the interprofessional side. The fact that doctors, from the very beginning of their training, get used to the idea that, I mean, of course they know it, but I mean, that they get used to the idea that they have to interact with larger staff and actually manage larger staff and rely on their collaborators, nurses in particular. So this really fits in well with the overall objectives that the university has set itself in the area of health and medicine, more in particular. So I won't talk any longer and give the floor to you directly, or? Well, I can't understand you, so I wasn't instructed on this, so I'm sorry. So whoever's next is please to come up. oh, Direttore Generale Pellan, I'm sorry. Okay. So in fact, I was instructed, but I forgot. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, have a good evening.
Grazie mille al Rettore Boaseres per la sua introduzione. Dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening. A warm welcome also from my end to this important podium discussion. And a thank you to Professor Hannawa and her team at the Università della Svizzera Italiana Center for the Advancement of Healthcare Quality and Patient Safety for organizing this event, which highlights a fundamental aspect of healthcare provision, safe communication. In the context of healthcare, which is becoming increasingly complex with more and more specializations and point of interface, and more dependent of new technological tools, more effective medication, and a growing number of acts per time unit, as well as by patients that are ever more knowledgeable and are having greater expectation than ever before. Communication between professionals and with patients and their families is not only important, but essential. Communication covers 360 degrees of healthcare delivery, from the organizational culture to patient involvement, to means for warranting the continuity of care, up to becoming a reason of error. Indeed, numerous studies have highlighted the fact that inadequate communication, be it missing, incomplete, untimely, or erroneous, along with problems linked to the human factor and leaderships, is one of the main causes for patient safety events. When error hits, if it's not supported by transparent communication with the patient and or the family, inside as well as outside the hospital, it will easily become a catastrophe. The trusting relationships between patient and doctor, which is the fundament of successful healthcare provision, will deteriorate in nearly unrecoverable ways, and the image of the hospital will be defaced in the public opinion. The politics of quality and patient safety of EOC, the Public Hospital of Cantone Ticino, sets this issue in high priority. We promote transparent, clear, and adequate communication that showcases our activities and our results to patient and the public, also when things go wrong. This transparency contributes to the active involvement of our patients. In fact, the evaluation of the quality of care must include the point of view of the patient. In parallel, the patient must be involved in the most adequate ways into the processes of diagnosis, therapy, and care. This involvement contributes to the prevention of errors in essential ways. An adequate communication is also the basis for cooperation and for the so-called team spirit. Interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity allow us to reach high-quality standards, but they require clear, complete, assertive, and timely communication. To communicate in adequate ways is not always easy in a complex context like healthcare. For this reason, it's fundamental to include evidence-based education and to introduce communication supporting tools such as computerization and digitalization. But even those tools are not free of risks that must be considered and managed. Tonight, thanks to this important podium discussion among internationally renowned experts, we have the chance to obtain a deeper insight into the topic of safe communication in healthcare. And we will be able to identify prospects, main challenges, and new solutions that contribute to a safer healthcare tomorrow for all of us. It's therefore a great honor for me to introduce and welcome the moderator of the podium discussion to this stage. Professor Sir Liam Donaldson started his medical career in surgery and was later trained in public health. He's a global leader and a recognized international champion of public health, healthcare quality, and patient safety. He's a former vice chairman of the World Health Organization's executive board and founding director of the World Health Organization's World Alliance for Patient Safety. He now serves as WHO's envoy for patient safety and chairman of the independent monitoring board for the polio eradication program. In the United Kingdom, he is Chancellor of Newcastle University, Professor of Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Honorary Distinguished Professor at Cardiff University. Sir Liam Donaldson was the Chief Medical Officer for England and the United Kingdom's Chief Medical Advisor from 1998 to 2010. During this time, he held critical responsibilities across the whole field of public health and healthcare, and he advised Secretaries of State of Health for Health, the Prime Minister, and other government ministers. He has produced landmark reports which have set health policy and legislation for several topics, from stem cell research to clinical governance, from quality and safety to infectious disease control, patient empowerment, poor clinical performance, smoke-free public places, medical regulation, and organ and tissue retention. In the 2002, Sir Liam Donaldson received a knighthood in recognition of his achievements in health and healthcare. Sir Liam Donaldson, thank you for coming. The floor is now yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Buongiorno, buonasera, guten Abend. It's wonderful to be here, and yet again, as an Englishman, I have to apologize for my country's appalling skills in other languages, which you master English so well, and we do so poorly. So I do apologize, but I'm going to continue in English. So I've got 5 reasons why I think the world of healthcare should be taking patient safety more seriously than it has been over the last several decades. The first is that the evidence of wide-scale harm to patients has been clear for a long, long time now. Since the mid-1990s, studies have repeatedly shown that something like 1 in 10 patients admitted to hospital have some form of error in their care. Not always serious, but in small number of cases, very serious, resulting in life-changing harm, disability, and death. The evidence is also clear that the problem is universal. And this is something which is both a negative point, because obviously a problem that's worldwide is a much bigger concern to everybody, but it's also a positive point, because I found that in my dealings with health ministers, one of their fears is having their service criticized in the media. And in a way, there is safety in numbers, because no health minister need fear that his or her country is standing out as an outlier worse than everybody else. Every country in the world is suffering this problem, and every country in the world has to talk about the negatives in order to get onto the positive agenda of achieving change. So the first reason we need to take it seriously is the evidence has been clear for a long time. The second reason we need to take it more seriously is that improvement has been very slow. The rector mentioned the airline industry, and although people sometimes get tired of that comparison, it is a very strong comparison. That industry has now reached a point where if you travel on a scheduled airline tomorrow, your chance of being killed is something like 1 in 10 million. Whereas in healthcare, that ratio is closer to 1 in several hundred. And the airline industry is a good way of setting a benchmark for healthcare to emulate. There are all sorts of differences, but there are more similarities than you might think. And improvement in healthcare must be probably the slowest of any of the high-risk industries that have improved safety over time. The third reason why we need to take it seriously is that simple, error-prone procedures recur. History repeats itself. So imagine the situation for patients and families and the public looking at the publicity about things that go wrong in healthcare in different countries. Somebody has the wrong operation. Somebody's diagnosis is wrong. A patient doesn't get their test results and then finds out later that they had cancer, and it would have been much better if their results had come through in time rather than getting lost in the system. People read about those things and they ask themselves as non-experts, as non-doctors, as non-nurses, how can these things happen? And think of their feelings becoming even worse when a few months later they read about something very similar happening again. In other words, the public would be right to conclude that we are not good at solving problems that threaten the health and well-being of our patients, and we need to get better. The fourth reason is that those human costs are very great indeed. I've spent the last 20 years involved one way or another in leading programs of patient safety, both in the UK, but also through the WHO. And I've talked to many, many victims of harm, both patients themselves who've been seriously injured or disabled by inadvertent errors in their care, but also very often to the families of someone who's died. And those people have suffered. Their lives are changed not just for the moment that it happens, but forever. And the devastation that I've seen happening because of unsafe care is really very chilling. And it's very humbling to see those people, many of whom have tried to overcome their grief and trauma in order to join us in the movement to try and make healthcare safer worldwide. And I think very often at events like this, when we think about how things happen, we should think, first of all, about honouring the memories of those who've died by showing that we can improve and make healthcare safer. And then finally, and I think this is a particularly strong argument to make in a wonderful university like this, is that patient safety is still the interest of a minority of researchers and enthusiasts and people that are passionate about it. If you look right across the world, it hasn't really entered the mainstream, so that every healthcare professional looks not just at their patient in front of them, but at the service surrounding them to understand what risks it carries for the patients and how they can provide more protection. It's just not in the paradigm, a traditional paradigm of professional training, to think more widely. The paradigm, quite rightly, is the focus on the patient. But until the paradigm of clinical practice is more widely scoped to involve thinking about the quality and safety of care provided to the hundreds of patients that go through a service every week or every month, then things will not improve. And there's a great opportunity for universities, particularly, to change their curricula so that the new doctor, the new nurse, the new health professional entering into the 21st century healthcare systems looks at the world differently and looks at how to make their service safer, not just doing their duty to every patient that they see, important though that is. So in the World Health Organization, we've tried to set challenges for the world. We had a challenge on healthcare infection, clean care is safer care. We then had a challenge on safe surgery with the checklist, and everybody signed up to that. And we've now launched in the last few months a medication safety challenge. Medication errors are probably one of the commonest ways in which people are harmed. Something like $52 billion US. It costs every year, the unsafe medication. And in England, a recent study, if you wanted to look at just one healthcare system, showed that there are 237 million drug medication-related errors every year. I mean, that's a phenomenal number to get your head round, but it just shows the scale of the problem and the depth of the problem that still has to be dealt with. So this evening, we're dealing with the very important aspect of communication. And I know from my work on patient safety, if you read all the literature on what causes harm, much of it conceptualizes communication as one risk factor along with others. And so it's very common to see an investigation or an inquiry report that says one of the causes of this accident was poor communication. What I think we're learning is that communication isn't just a narrow strand of causation along with 10 other factors. It's actually at the heart of what makes organizations work, what drives the processes of care, and certainly what governs the interaction between patients, doctors, and nurses, and then between the team members that the rector mentioned in his introduction. So often our mistake has been to educate in silos, even though we're trying to prepare people to practice in teams. And universities, again, have a great opportunity to reshape not just their curriculum so that it contains more substance and more concepts in safety, but also to ensure that there's much more equity between the professions so that they grow up as students working together and seeing each other's disciplines rather than the traditional educational route which many universities have had in the past of educating in silos, and the teamwork then has to be learned at a postgraduate level. So thank you everybody for coming in such large numbers tonight. We know that there are many people watching the live stream on the internet, and we look forward very much to picking up some of the themes that all of you are interested in during the panel discussion that we'll be having in a few moments' time. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce Adriana Di Giorgi. She is a leader within the cantonal system here, and her work has involved a lot of initiatives and projects and leadership in relation to quality and safety. Adriana.
Thank you. Buonasera a tutti anche da parte mia. Dear ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dear Professor Hannawa, thank you for your invitation to this important event. So, what are the horizons and the future perspective of patient safety in Ticino? I will take only a few minutes to provide some input that might be developed during this evening. Today in Ticino, as in the rest of the Switzerland and probably the world, we are witnessing the digitization of healthcare. Hospitals are being equipped with electronic medical records, and the cantons, as required by federal legislation, are organizing health networks in Ticino, Retisan. Moreover, the fragmentation of care and further specialization of the institutions requires continuity and fluid transmission of information. The digitization allows the transmission of data in the transition of care. These activities, even if they are not free of risk, to mention only the issue of data protection, are certain to improve the safety of patients through better sharing of information and communication among the partners that take patients in their charge. Safety, however, is created by people, and it is the people who make the difference. Thanks to reactive analysis in case of error, aimed at discovering the factors which helped bring the error along, as well as proactive analysis as in healthcare failure mode and critical effect analysis, for instance, we have the opportunity to make the context in which health operators act safer. Said in simpler words, this kind of approach allows us to make it difficult to make errors and simple to operate in a correct way. The digitization, in this sense, to my mind, has given and can still give an important contribution. Streamlining of processes, introduction of reminders and warnings directly in the electronic records, and so on. However, we should never forget that the human factor is and will continue to be decisive. In this sense, the ways in which people related to each other and thus the interpersonal communication, as well as the modality in which the professionals act in a determined context and how they respond to the stimuli deriving from them, are crucial. It is therefore necessary, as described by Olnagel in 2014, to make a leap and go from a reactive approach that focuses on the number of adverse events and learning from the same to a resilient approach which focuses on the development of capabilities to be successful in variable conditions. It is precisely in this context that concept mentioned before by the General Director of AOC, Giorgio Pellanda, as transparency, involvement of patient, teamwork, and, if I may add one more, accountability, concepts that stand at the basis of patient safety, acquire their whole significance and importance. In order to cultivate this resilience, the approaches and tools to improve quality and patient safety, following the idea of never the first time on a patient, start including tools like simulation. Simulation, first invented to develop technical skills, is evolving and considers more and more non-technical skills, promoting thus the development of multi- and interdisciplinary cooperation and teamwork, as well as the growth of individual responsibility by acquiring and using teamwork skills. Right here in Lugano, there's an advanced simulation center of emergency medicine, CESAMU, which by rendering available methods and vanguard technologies for simulation allows the acquisition and training even of the softest and most relational skills. The development of resilience goes hand in hand, among other things, with the assumptions of one's own individual responsibility, the creation of positive relationships, dialogue, and constructive connection among healthcare professionals and with patients and their families. The development of resilience is therefore supported by initiatives for promotion of interprofessional and patient-related communication, such as the initiative Speak Up When Remaining Silent is Dangerous, launched on a national level in September 2017 by the Swiss Patient Safety Foundation. To speak up, in other words, means to react and to consult colleagues and seniors when the safety of patients is threatened or seems to be so. It needs a favorable context, a clear commitment on all hierarchy levels, and of course, education and adequate information both for professionals and the patient and families. All in this way, the person speaking up has the possibility to communicate in an assertive, timely, clear, and complete manner. On the other hand, the person receiving the speak up is prepared to accept criticism, a suggestion or an advice, and to be actively cooperative. In conclusion, considering the crucial importance of safe interpersonal communication in healthcare, I'm sure that this issue must be a constant theme in all the discussion focused on patient safety and quality of care in Ticino and everywhere else. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Now we're going to move to the panel discussion. I'm going to start by asking Annegret Hannawa just to say a few words of context, and then I'll ask her and the other panel members up to the stage.
Thank you very much, Liam. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see that many people here in the room. So I'd like to just briefly frame the evening with what safe communication means, so we all have the same language, the same understanding of the topic. So we know that studies have shown up to 80% of preventable patient harm in severe cases is caused by poor communication. But what does that kind of communication look like, and what does that feel like in practice? So if we translate that into numbers, that means that in Switzerland alone, at Swiss hospitals, 4 patients die every day. Across the world, it's 80,000 patients every day who die not because of an illness, not because of poor care, but simply because the care participants did not attain a shared understanding.
Yeah, I think so.
So we have a great master's program here, and I have a couple of students who went on their own with their own initiative to the Sesamo, to the simulation center that Adriana just mentioned. And they took a case that happened in the United States a couple of years ago and enacted it at the simulation center. So since we're at UZI here, I'd like to briefly showcase what that communication may look like in practice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye. Hi, Miss Jones. Nice to see you again. What's happening today?
Oh, my stomach, it hurts so much.
Okay. I'm sorry. Miss Jones, your veins are collapsed. I can't get the IV right now. I'm going to go order some tests.
Hello, Miss Jones. How are you?
I'm not good.
What's the problem this time?
My stomach hurts so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Since when does it hurt so much?
Since 5 days.
5 days. Why do you come now and not before?
I don't know.
Wasn't it so important, the pain in the last day?
It hurts.
Yes, but I need to know how is the evolution of this pain. Okay, this patient is an addict. It's a drug-seeking behavior, so we can give her 60 milligram Toradol EM. I have to go to the OR. He said 60 milligram Toradol EM. Thank you.
All right, Miss Jones, I'll be right back. Such a high dose of Toradol. Could be nephrotoxic for her. It's just not right. She's only got 1 kidney and renal cell cancer. It's no good. All right, Toradol 30. Toradol 30. All right, let's try that IV again. Hold on, Miss Jones. I'll be with you in a second. Okay, we're going to try that IV again. Oh, hello, doctor.
Yes?
I was able to get IV access.
Oh, that's
Would
good.
it be better to put the Toradol through the IV?
I will rewrite the order.
Okay.
Okay, done.
Thank you. Okay, Miss Jones, we've got it. Okay. Oh no. Oh, I gave her 60 milligrams, not 30.
So this was the red carpet screening. I think Elisa and Lisa, very much, if you want to get up for a second and show yourselves. These are 2 master students at the Communication Management and Health Master. And also Dr. Anselmi is here today. Is he here tonight, or is he in Bellinzona? At the EOT Bellinzona, who helped us create this event, and also Dan Pasquale at the Sesamo. So this is what the potential of simulation can give us as well in terms of pedagogical perspective for students. But what this shows is that we've attempted for years now, as Liam knows as well, to improve communication in practice. So we've implemented many different things. For those of you from healthcare, you will know about team steps with iPass and SBAR and Candor and CUS and Spikes, and then also the digitization of care, attempting to solve that problem. But still we see those numbers in care practice every day that I just mentioned before. So what do we need to do differently? And as you can see in this excerpt that just happened, I guess, as I said, a couple of years ago, there's much more to communication than just information storage or information exchange. So just to briefly summarize what we've done here at the CACS in the past is we've developed a model that's based on analyses of case incidents that we found that 5 communication processes tend to redundantly go wrong every single time. We summarized them under the acronym SACHA. Those define 5 core competencies. We'll get back to that later in the discussion again. Just very briefly, this is what it looks like, and we'll get back to talking about the content in a matter of saving time. But what that model does, and I'd like to just briefly mention that for the discussion as well, is it doesn't just name errors, it doesn't just identify communication problems or strengths. We are also able to identify sort of core misassumptions that underlie those errors or those communication problems, as we label them, that even create that fertile soil for them to happen. So what are some of those things? There's 9 of them in total. I'm only going to summarize 3 of them for you to just get a feel of what that means. And all of us may resonate with them. The first one is a game that we all played when we were children. Each country, I understand from the talks I've been given, knows that game. Some call it the silent post game. Some call it the telephone game, the Chinese whisper game. We played that when we were children, whispering into someone's ear a message, and then people keep whispering it across, and then by the time it comes out at the very end, it's a different message. We knew as children it doesn't work. Why do we have a handoff problem in healthcare? Never assume that a message arrives and is understood as originally intended. Another core misassumption that tends to underlie those errors in the making is that we tend to attribute the same things or different things with the same words. So if I say the word tree, for example, then James, what kind of tree do you think of when I say the word tree? Christmas tree. Christmas tree. Anybody else? Dr. Pelenda? Very good. Okay, well, I think of a birch, right? So we can use the same word, but think of very different things. So we've had cases that we've analyzed. We talk about medication safety today. We don't always use the same labels with what we have in mind. So why do we have a medication safety issue? So that is, never assume that others associate the same things with your words like you do. And then last but not least, we tend to assume that communication transpires through words. But in fact, in communication with science, we know that 93% of the meaning out of messages we derive from nonverbal communication. And so we have many incidents there as well, that allows us to conclude that we never assume that communication transpires through words. We must take into account body language as well as other messages that we express, just like seen in that video, through other means of communication. So that's to summarize briefly the framework of what we talk about when we refer to safe communications. I'd like to conclude now, and I look forward to having a discussion also with the audience. Thank you.
I apologize, I'm having a bit of trouble with the headset here. But I'd like to introduce the other members of the panel now, ask them to come up on stage. So if we could start with Kai Schnabel. He is head of the Department of Education and Media at the Institute for Medical Education at the University of Bern. So welcome, Kai. Yvonne Willems-Cavalli from originally Amsterdam and now Switzerland, and her career has been in nursing, and she holds a role as Chief Nursing Officer. Marco Egbring. He is head physician at the Clinic for Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology at Zurich University, and is particularly interested in the use of informatics to improve medication safety. Thank you. And then finally, Dr. Yvonne Gilly, who is a practicing physician and a member of the board of the Swiss Medical Association. And maybe I could have the handheld microphone at some point because the headset is slipping off. So to start, could I Oh, and James Titcombe. James Titcombe. Yeah, James is representing the patient voice in this particular discussion. We'll be hearing more about his story later. Okay, well, I actually would like to start with James. Whenever I was first involved in the world of quality and safety many, many years ago, it was very rare to have the patient voice directly in the room. And James is somebody who, in the UK, his family's story is very well known because it was the subject of a major public inquiry and widespread media attention. But James, at the heart of it, was a very human story about the birth of your son, something which had been greatly anticipated with very positive feelings, and then things started to go wrong. So would you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Absolutely. So it was our second child, Joshua. I'd already had a 3.5-year-old girl. We were all greatly looking forward to Joshua's safe arrival. And it's a very long, complicated story, but basically my wife's waters broke about 3 weeks before Joshua was due. She went to hospital, was checked out, various visits to the hospital, and Joshua was born about 36 hours later. Immediately after Joshua's birth, my wife collapsed with an infection as she was given antibiotics and fluids. And the question then immediately became, what about Joshua? And we were reassured by the midwives looking after him that Joshua was fine, it's your wife you need to worry about. And the summary really is that over the next 24 hours, Joshua actually had many signs that he was an unwell baby, he was developing sepsis. Those signs weren't acted on. Our concerns about Joshua were basically ignored, and Joshua collapsed at 24 hours of age and sadly died 9 days later.
And one of the striking things about safety, when you look at it globally, is the extent to which some of the things that happen are universal. They're not specific to any particular healthcare system. And one of the factors that you encountered, which victims of harm all over the world describe, is you met a wall of resistance in finding out what went wrong. Yeah. Would you tell us a little bit about how the hospital authorities reacted to you in the immediate aftermath of Joshua's death?
Absolutely, and it's worth saying at that time I was working in the engineering industry as a nuclear project manager, very used to kind of a safety-focused approach. And to my horror, really, about a week after Joshua died, we were told that the records of his care had gone missing. And to this day, actually, Liam, there are no records of any of Joshua's observations from the time he was born to the time he collapsed. We didn't have an inquest. The reports we eventually got from the trust contained huge discrepancies about what we know happened and what was reported to have happened. And it took 2.5 years later, we managed to get an inquest that eventually revealed some problems. And then eventually in 2015, there was the publication of a major inquiry called the Kirkup Report that actually revealed that the trust for years, from 2004 onwards, had been not investigating incidents properly, had been covering up their own failures, and this resulted in harm to mothers and babies ongoing throughout that whole period of time.
And when I talked to you about this on a previous occasion, and obviously read your book about the tragic circumstances, there were a couple of things that struck me. One was that, and I'm now focusing on the communication, that whilst most of your experiences were very negative, there were islands of compassion in the middle of it. In the middle of a terrible negative experience, there were some elements of positivity. Absolutely. And that's something that a lot of victims of harm talk about. It's not a homogeneous single theme. So tell us a little bit about the time where you felt somebody was really feeling for you at a human level.
Absolutely. So there's been a couple of major turning points. One, as you say, this wall of silence is there. We had the first investigation that we weren't happy with. We had a second investigation we weren't happy with. And there was one person, she was actually the head of midwifery at the NMC, as it happens, who out of everybody, the response was, there's nothing wrong with this report. James Titcom's, you know, making a fuss about nothing. And actually she had the courage to stand up and say, I don't think this is right. I think there's more we could do. This isn't good enough. And that one person made a huge difference because that sparked a second investigation. And there's been other examples. The moment I met the police officer at Cumbria Police, he was a gentleman actually who had experience of losing a baby himself. And I remember the look in his eyes, you know, and recognising he knew what I was talking about. He knew that I wasn't making these issues up, and he started an investigation which actually made a huge difference. So,
yeah. And then just one final thing, and we'll come back later before we pass on to other panel members. But we were talking earlier, just before we came in, about the danger of hierarchies and the fact that worldwide, often the medical profession is the dominant profession. And we saw on the student's video that the nurse found it difficult to challenge a senior doctor, which occurs over and over again in these incidents that you hear about. In some ways, your story was an example of a reversal of hierarchies, in that I think the inquiry report, or one of the inquiries that took place, said that the doctors had trouble coming onto the ward because they needed the permission of the midwives, which is a very curious reversal of the usual.
Absolutely. So poor communication runs throughout Joshua's care, from us trying to raise concerns with midwives, but also the culture in the unit at the time was very focused on kind of a natural birth approach that developed into an approach where actually it was bad, you know, keep the doctors away unless it's an emergency, and that resulted in terrible communication problems. And to this day, you know, some midwives swear that they phoned a doctor and had a conversation, and all the doctors say no, that never happened. So there was this terrible breakdown, people working in silos, and they weren't working as one team, which actually, fortunately, in the UK, there's a lot of work in maternity services focusing on the importance of working as one team.
Thank you now for now, James. Yvonne, people often in the quality and safety world, they often say that the nurses are more inherently interested in this subject than perhaps the doctors are. But picking up this idea of a hierarchy and the fact that the nursing profession often feels or is made to feel subordinate, junior nurses not able to speak up if they see something going wrong. Do you think that still persists, or is it starting to go? And in your experience of developing nursing as a profession in relation to patient safety, is it something that still needs a lot of work?
Well, I think it is better nowadays, but it's still a problem. And you have to acknowledge that. I mean, it has to do with communication, and collaboration has to do with the culture and with the work environment. So it's not so easy to give just one answer. As I said, work environment, if you have a good work environment where you have healthy relationships in the team, then it's easier to feel safe to say something, which we saw also in the video. The nurse wanted to say something, she hesitated, and if you hesitate, you can have a problem, and that problem can be dangerous for the patient. So that's the first thing. And then we have to acknowledge that for healthy care relationships, are things which you always hear, and you said, well, that's so simple, but it is about respect, respect from both ways. It is about trust, and then it's not functional trust because you are the doctor or you are the chief doctor, but it's about relational trust, and you have to earn that. Then, if this is functioning, then you will have open communication and you will be more transparent. And if you have open and honest communication, then I will give you also the support visibly. So then, when you speak about culture, you are true. It's often in certain situations or in certain countries or in certain places, there's still a dominant hierarchy, a dominant collaborationship. And you have to tackle that. So we have to go to a partnership-based collaboration, which means that you have this partnership-based between professionals, and it's not about the position you have, but it's about experience. It's about the expertise. You have to learn from each other to do better, and but it has also to do with partnership with the patients and the families. Normally, we see, for instance, we see families as visitors in a ward. We don't see them as participants who we can ask together with the patient to give their point of view. So, politically correct is when you always says the patient's at the center. We all say that. But there's a big difference between writing patient on the center, and the patient is then rather passive because we know best for you and we discuss everything, but we decide. That's not the thing like partnership-based with the patient. So I can go on for another hour.
No, I think it's a subject that we're all passionate about. But Kai, you have some of the educational solutions. How would medical professional, nursing education, health education, how would it have to look different to ensure that people come out of it with without the hierarchy, with a mutual respect, and, if you like, oven ready, as we would say, to work in teams rather than waiting to be baked afterwards?
Yes, thank you, Liam. It's a very good question. We try to educate our students in a more global way, and we try to put on more and more interprofessional education sessions in the medical education. And what we did, maybe with the largest impact on the medical education in the last years, was to make communication as a demand for the federal licensing examination in Switzerland. So as we know from very good publications, that up to 80% of medical errors consists out of some communication errors. There's a big publication where they compared those students who were very good in communication in the last exam with the ones who are very poor in communication, and those who were poor in communication had significantly higher percentage of having trouble with the health administration and with patient reclaims and things like this. And so we made it in the federal licensing exam countable for the students, that we wanted to reward those students who are good in communication. So it is now 25% of the grade of the last examination in Switzerland is communication. And the wonderful side effect we had with this, when we introduced it 2011 in the assessment, all the faculties looked at this examination and they were planning it together, and at all medical faculties in Switzerland, there's coming up communication courses at the faculties. And even though we are not quite sure how precisely valid we can measure how good a student communicates in this formal examination, because it's sometimes not very objective. But I think the very good thing we did is that we made it countable at the last exam, and all the faculties looking now on communication issues. So we had a lot of courses with different settings, with simulation, with standardized patients, with simulated patients, where students get feedback about their communication. And that was quite new. When I studied medicine in the last century, nobody cared about communication at all. It was a whole cognitive subject. And in not at one part of my exam, communication skills were rewarded in any grade also. It was just how much you know, yes. But it's not enough to know how things are going. You have to communicate it to the patients, to your peers, and to the health professional staff as well, to prevent errors.
Let me ask you another question, because this is almost, if you ignore all the detail, there's some fundamental goals that I think we're trying to achieve, which you've already talked about in the last few minutes. But I can remember when I was a medical student in the late 1960s, early 1970s, it was all about factual learning. We didn't have any communication training at all. And then I went to a new medical school in England, and I was a lecturer, and we had a course which exposed students in their first year to patients. They didn't learn any clinical work, but it was quite innovative at the time, in that this would be in the mid-1980s. They went out and spent time with patients with chronic disease or disability, and then they came back with to discussion groups, and I was a junior lecturer and I was in charge of a discussion group. And I think the intention of those who designed the curriculum, many of whom were traditionalists, was that they would learn clinical facts at an early stage. But actually, in the discussion groups, they were pouring with emotion because they were angry on the patient's behalf. They'd seen doctors talking to the patients in a disrespectful way, and they were exactly the way a person in the street who saw this. They'd come in, they'd had no formal structure to their education. And I saw the same students 5 years later when they were graduating, and they no longer held those attitudes. They had become professionalized, and they no longer saw things through the patient's eyes. So in our educational program today, can we say that, at least to some extent, we're helping the young students to see things or feel things as the patient would feel? Or is this just dealing with the surface part of communication, rather than the feelings that lead to the good communication?
Okay, I don't know every student what he feels and how empathic he goes into the patient's thoughts. But what we are doing to try to help them is we expose them beginning in the first year with patients in the general practice. And we have a parallel communication curriculum starting in the first year. So every year, nearly every other week, they have some sessions where they are dealing with patient-doctor communication. So they are getting feedback by simulated patients, for example, where they are in a role play, and they get very, very authentic feedback by these simulated patients, how they felt in the talk with the patient. Some of the sessions are videotaped, and we are starting right now in Bern to let the students annotate by themselves the video recorded sessions with the standardized patients, and give them a framework how to annotate these video recordings. So, and we are trying to give the students all over their 6-year studies here communication education, and in a kind of spiral curriculum that they get more and more challenged over the years. And then we have the final assessment, and in between we have 2 other practical assessments where they get grades for showing good communication. Does it answer your question?
Okay, it does. It's a good answer. Thank you. Annegret, communication, training, education can be superficial and it can be deep. What does deep communication training look like?
The deep communication. Well, I'd like us to move away from thinking of communication as this big mountain that none of us can encounter. So I'd like to keep it actually at a more superficial level than I think we need to go deep into it at this point in time, because what we've seen in those cases is that very basic, as I mentioned before, very basic things are not being done. So we're not even reaching, for example, hardly any quantity of information exchange. So we just simply by realizing that communication oftentimes does not take place because we think it already has been taking place, or by assuming others have taken care of tasks, assuming that others have understood the things that we attempted to convey. So I think that if we were just to step in and, also in the educational platforms and establish certain course misassumptions, correct them, I would assume that we're already taking care of much of the problem before we even need to step into teaching core skills like what I mentioned before. So I'd like to take out the pressure and bring it down to let's start small. And I think also the event today, let's start small and not think of patient safety as such a huge challenge, and take that first step being
so
into that
looking
direction.
at the video, what's the route to improvement?
So that was a multidimensionally complex video. There was interprofessional problems going on. There was patient communication, obviously evidently in that context of the patient having that pain going on. But I think for that part, definitely the nurse addressing the barrier to a shared understanding, which is always the challenge we're visioning. What is a barrier to a shared understanding in that sense? That was that interprofessional hierarchy. So the nurse attempted to establish that. But it nicely shows also, and I don't know how I was enacting that, is that it's not enough if one person enacts safe communication. Communication happens in between people, so all actors need to be activated into contributing to that shared understanding. So it's not enough that the nurse attempts to cross down that barrier, but all people have to equally engage themselves into making that happen.
Okay, thank you. Yvonne Gilly, you have this key role with the Swiss Medical Association. Now, a lot of medical associations around the world, national medical associations, are often perceived as bodies that don't like a lot of change. How do you think doctors are looking at this field of safety, where it may mean that they have to standardize some of their practices, do their educational on a more of a multi-professional basis, learn communication when perhaps some of them feel that they're already good communicators? Why do they need? So how do you find attitudes, and whether you think there needs to be any change?
Well, I mean, that's a stereotype that the medical association is a kind of a virtual body. It's not the humans seeing in it, but you can stereotype the face of it just because of that. And I think the socialization as a doctor in my generation, and that's still the ruling generation in the medical association and also in the faculties and in the different specialities, they are actually really socialized, and that was one of the intrinsic factors of being a doctor, that you are a highly respected person in society, and that creates a hierarchy, and you get socialized into this hierarchy, and that has some kind of touch of we are not the ones who make mistakes. We are. I mean, that was sort of the stereotype of the gods in white, and it can in this polarization it can just reverse, and it probably reversed in the situation with the babies and the midwives ruling the wards and didn't let doctors have access to critically ill babies. So if we live in a world of polarization, and we actually have to work on it. And I mean, examples are the educational scheme now at the University of Bern. Examples are new role models, because we have to work interprofessionally. So we have to learn from nurses, because the doctors can't work without nurses, and nurses with growing self-esteem and also with having access to university levels also in Switzerland. I mean, in other countries that was earlier. They are socialized in roles with and expect being respected on the same level. So actually it begins in childhood. It's kind of goes along with the changes in society. And then you have to work on the education. And I think we have kind of a gap between the younger generation and the older generation, and we have to bridge that. But in fact, it is a challenge. I think the medical association as a body is a rather conservative organization, as the faculties at university, the medical faculties, it's the same with them. But there is a sort of a disruption now going on, and that has to do with changes in society, that has to do with also shared decision making and changing the roles of patients in society, that has to do with changing the roles of nurses and other health professionals. And the young doctors are definitely different than the elder ones, so we can learn from each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Marco, when people mention artificial intelligence, they tend to think of robots. But your work isn't really about robots, it's about data and information. What do you think it has to offer, and can you see how it fits into a communication framework, or is it something entirely different?
Tricky question. I think not everyone is familiar with being a clinical pharmacologist. Usually if something happens to the patient, like an adverse drug event, you're going to ask the pharmacologist, the problem here, is it the drug or is it probably the diagnose? So then you gather information, and usually communication for us is just reading the medical record, usually on the computer. So communication is easy for us. But every time we then ask, and then we figured out what's the problem, but then every time you go on the ward, and for example, you talk to the patient, and the patient tells you, I also take this this medicine I brought from my last vacation from Vietnam, it completely changes the picture, what may be the problem. So communication is first about gathering all the information, that's true, but it's also having like this shared understanding, so having, like in medical data, having structured data, easily available. And then the next thing is, even if you have like the perfect information together, you consult, for example, as a clinical pharmacologist, we consult drug databases. They cost a lot of money, and there's several of them. And even if you just look up the problem in 3 databases, you may have a different decision if you consider the 4th database. So there's different information available everywhere. So you have the perfect information, but even then, it's almost impossible to make like the perfect decision. And this is something where I think machine learning will assist the physician in the future. I think machine learning is just a tool for physicians to help them make the right decisions, because they can consider, a machine just can consider more factors. You're not limited to 4 databases and 10 medications and the lab values of the patient. You actually can consider the past of 1 million patients in your hospital, what you have learned, and all the factors you have in structured data. So I think the process will dramatically change for the physician, not being the one really thinking about the problem. I think machines will calculate the probabilities of certain risk or certain diagnose, and it's for the physician increasingly important to have good communication skills for the patient then, because the main task, in my opinion, will be for the physician to explain to the patient the options we have, the risks associated to it. It's not really about gathering data. The patient should probably enter the data in an app, have this structured like a diary, just accessible to the physician. They don't have to talk about it, it's just visualized on the screen. So that's why I'm very glad the physician already is changing their curriculum. More communication.
I mean, just look at the potential disruptive effect of this, because at the moment, and traditionally, the health professional has held the information and released it to the patient bit by bit. With the direction of travel with technology and the extent to which some of the leading tech companies are trying to provide information directly to their consumers, could you envisage a situation where the roles are reversed and the patient has the information first, and then over time, as the analytical tools become more sophisticated, they don't just have the information, but they have insights into what the information means, and then they seek help from the healthcare professional on something that they feel they already know and understand, and they're just wanting some feedback and advice on what they have in mind for their treatment plan. Could it go as far as that, where the whole paradigm of health professional patient was turned on its head?
I wouldn't say it's turned on its head, because if I feel sick, I have information, and only if I go to you as a physician, you will learn about the information I have. So it's more about the asynchronous communication, the travel of the information. So if I'm your patient and I enter the data, for example, in an app with a certain rule set, you can be notified of a problem I have, but I don't consider it as dangerous, for example. But you know as a physician, okay, this may be dangerous for this patient because I know the history of the patient and I have learned this may be a problem. So it's not about having just information on my end. It's very much about, in my opinion, having collaboration of communication, so working on the communication as a channel together from the patient, because all the information to the patient, all his history is just a channel of information you have to share. I think that's what communication is, a shared reality. So the technology just helps us to, disengage from I have to go to you in order to present you my information.
James, how do you see it from a patient point of view? The changes in the, both in the diagnostic tools becoming less smaller, more near patient, which is the jargon that's used, and also the patient possibly having more information. I mean, we used to be horrified at young people Googling their symptoms, but it's becoming less of a fear that they'll get it completely wrong now when you see some of the developments.
To some extent, patients are already, as you say, Googling my dad's a typical example of that. He's completely diagnosed himself on Google, quite successfully actually. But absolutely, I think it's the direction that technology is going in, and I think empowering, I'm seeing that as kind of empowering patients to be more informed, to take more onus and perhaps more responsibility about their own health, and using those tools, as I say, in conjunction, in partnership with healthcare professionals. It's never going to be a case of one or the other, it's always going to be a partnership. But absolutely, can see many, many advantages and reasons why it's a sensible direction. It's inevitable, actually, I think.
And I guess you would say, Annegret, that the laws of communication are like the laws of physics, that they won't change no matter how different the healthcare system looks.
Well, I'd like to say a warning to this discussion. I think that technology can be used to support the communication process, but we may never delegate communication to technology. Because in the end, what technology is, it's an information carrier. It's a channel to pass information through, but the meaning, the understanding of that information still happens in between people. It doesn't happen in people's heads. It does happen in people's heads right now. That's why we see harm occurring. So we have many, many cases where communication is just passed through in those kind of channels. Then sometimes people don't get that information, they don't look it up, they don't access it, or they don't interpret it as it was intended. So I think that we must essentially use that technology just as a supporting aid for communication, but we may never rely or delegate communication to that completely. So to say that, yes, it can facilitate information access, it can facilitate information sharing, it can facilitate everyone having access to information, but also in terms of receiving information that's politically bad news, potentially bad news. We know the physician placebo effect is much more potent than any medication that you could give to a patient. So having that empathic conversation with a physician is much more meaningful and very important also for patient safety in that sense. So I would just express that as a warning. Never replace communication with technology. Use it as a facilitator for communication.
I want to bring you in. Now, please don't let me down by falling silent and not asking any questions. There's enough people here. Somebody's going to ask the first question. So who's it going to be? Yes, please. Right.
Thank you for the very rich input. I actually know where to start. So you're clearly putting the emphasis on communication. Communication is among individuals. And so I don't think that, I've not heard, unless I was asleep, as you say, anyone, actually questioning the structure. You even said, the laws of communication are like the laws of physics, so you can do whatever you want. But it seems to me that if you want to talk about open communication, if things are the way they are, there probably is a reason, right? Okay, so if you want to implement open communication, you can try, but it looks like there are some obstacles. The way I see a hospital is a place where there is a hierarchy, because there is huge responsibilities to be taken, right? And you have to be able to identify who's responsible at every time. So you mentioned accountability. And so I think this works both in two ways. If you're not responsible, then you're not accountable for the responsibility. So you might let someone else take the responsibility at some point. In the case of the example, in the end, it's the doctor who said, well, do this and do that. In the end, the nurse can just do whatever, she's told to do. And so I think, structurally, and this has been proven by sociologists, places like aircraft carriers or submarines, very dangerous places, actually don't experience many accidents, because what they actually do is that whenever anybody spots a problem, they're, in a sense, obliged to mention that there is a problem, but they will not be actually, held accountable for it. Because globally, this is much, for the safety of the aircraft carrier, this is more important than actually finding the person who's actually responsible for it. So this is nothing really to do with a communication problem. And it's the general rule, and in the structure, and if you're just free to say that you think that there is a problem, well, so it's about the organization. So this is a part missing, so far. So I was wondering whether you think this is actually something that is important or not.
Thank you. Excellent question. Yvonne, we hear a lot about trying to operate a blame-free culture, but often when the blame goes, it's the nurse that gets the blame in the team when an error occurs. Have you seen examples of organizations which are able to deal with this question of accountability? Obviously, it's often misunderstood because there are situations where there's negligent behavior where you do have to hold an individual to account, but those are quite uncommon compared to the situation where there's an honest failure, but then a form of blame is attributed to it, is used which shouldn't be used.
Well, I think in general, we know that if there has been an error, it's often, or almost all the time, a problem of the system. So it's not the single person, it's not just one act, it's a lot of acts. And that's why with the safety quality systems we have in the hospitals, we are looking at everything. But at the end, you try to have a no-blame culture in your hospital, but at the end, the law, or the how you call it in English, persecutore,
professional regulation.
Thank you. Will ask who did this, and who has written this, and who was responsible, who was on duty at that time. And then you can have your whole culture of no blame in the hospital, but at the end, somebody has done the fault. So that is a problem. And I think we have to go on to show to everybody that we have to learn from our errors. So we have to speak about it, and to speak about it, and to avoid that blame culture. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult. If something happens in the hospital, then outside the law, the lawyer wants to know everything. He wants to have everything written or not written, and looks for a name, because it's easy. It's much more difficult to say it were a whole bunch of problems which brought to this. And for instance, if we look back to the movie we saw, when we speak about communication, we often said you have to avoid assumptions, and you have to suspect your judgment, and you have to listen. 3 very simple rules. But if you look at the physician we saw, he didn't ask the nurse what was the problem. He didn't suspend his assumptions and his judgment, because the first thing was not about the renal cell cancer the girl had. No, she's a drugs addict. So he didn't even did an assessment, a clinical assessment. He just brought down the thing. And these things are happening, and you have to be aware that you're in front of you have a vulnerable person, because we're talking about that patients are looking on the computer and they find out. But still, you are vulnerable when you are a patient, and you want to have a doctor who puts everything together, and a nurse who's empathic and who looks at you and has an attitude where she listens and where they work together. Patients feel when people don't work together. And the problem that nurses and doctors, we for 50 years now, we say collaboration between physicians and nurses are pivotal. And still there are problems. We all said how you can handle it with education, with but it's also every single day we all must take our responsibility. Also the nurses, the physiotherapist, and the patient and the family, we all are in this together. So it's about taking your responsibility. Now I lose the fil rouge.
Yeah. That's a very good answer anyway, thank you. Hello.
I think the air flight carrier is a very good example for specialists. Like if you're a cardiologist and you have a highly standardized procedure, spotting the error is very easy. Not it's easy, but it's possible. But being a general practitioner, for example, is not having like the same plane landing every time. It's like you have all kinds of planes landing on your ship. Sometimes it's just a propeller machine, and you really have to adjust, and often an error can be not the correct decision. So often it's not possible for one person, if there's a hierarchy, to make this right decision. So often it's necessary for the physician consult with other physicians, consult with the nurse, in order to understand, okay, this plane is not gonna land because it's jumbo on our aircraft carrier, so we have to send it somewhere else. So I think if it's highly standardized, like in the airplane industry, it's kind of easy to spot, and hierarchy is a solution. But I think for medicine, where sometimes it's freestyle, it's much more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Other questions and comments, please? Yes, please, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. I've got a question which is less about the communication between a physician and a patient, but more the fact that we know that the scale of patient safety is enormous, and as Sir Liam introduced, we're taking a long time to address this. So I'm thinking about communication between politicians, healthcare system leaders, and the wider population. What does communication Does it give us tools to better get the scale of the problem acknowledged and dealt with at a kind of geopolitical level? What's the communication perspective and advice?
Yvonne, would you, as the nearest thing to a politician that we've got, you'd like to comment?
I mean, it eigentlich comes to the basic communication rules as well. I remember just one particular legislation that was the managed care law in Switzerland. I mean, I there participated as a parliamentarian in a subcommittee who had to prepare this legislation, and we were 7 people from different parties. And everyone had a different conception of what he or she meant under the title of managed care. And it took us 1 year of half days, whole days session to understand each other. And after this time, we then let participating stakeholders like insurance companies, representatives of insurance companies, of doctors' associations, of patients' groups. And at this stage, we were able to listen because we had a common understanding, we in this subgroup. And then the whole procedure sort of went through the whole committee. So you began kind of again. And it took us about 2 years, these processes. And it was actually really important because that legislation, that was an example of one of the rather rare examples where we had a consensus solution over all parties. It failed in the end, but that were different reasons, but it was an interesting communication processes. I have the same experience in the interprofessional group for the law on implementing the electronic patient record or file. It took us, it takes us, I mean, we published a record on e-medication, an interprofessional record. It took us 2 years to come out with this record, and we are working now since 2 years on a patient summary, more or less, and if you have to bring together different cultures, that means different value system, as you have in politics, different professions, different expertise. You need time, because you can't establish a communication culture, and it's about relationships between these people, and it's about the culture of how you communicate, even if you don't agree at all. But it's about trust, it's about respect, it's about win-win situations. It's and we know about that, but we often ignore it. So we put ourselves under time pressure.
Do you think, Yvonne, though, that in dealing with politicians and trying to convince them to make policies, that it's a form of advocacy, really? And I've always found in dealing with politicians, they're always easier to persuade them when you can give them a very concrete human interest side to it. So, for example, if you look at the recent developments in safety, one thing which has had huge traction both in many countries but also globally is the problem of sepsis. And there you can present the politician with a child that has died because their problem wasn't recognized and dealt with, and therefore they see themselves doing good for other children. But I think sometimes the mistake has been made with patient safety advocacy is you try and sell to politicians a concept. You can't sell a concept. It's got to be about the granularity of an actual real-life example. But Annegret, you've done a bit of work with health ministers in the summit meeting and in Germany as well, I think. What's your impression of what it takes to get this on the political agenda, and what sort of communication it takes?
I think it's simplicity. It's what you also mentioned. So the pathway of getting there is, I think, as you mentioned, Yvonne, very important. Is that the realization that the biggest barrier we have to overcome is to focus on the matter and not on the people. So that we know we need to focus on really understanding what's out there. And then the second part of that is making that graspable, making that very simple, because we come also from a very informed background. We see that from translation from science into practice. It's a big topic, it's lots in there, but if we simplify it to something that's graspable, then there's always the question of cost savings and life savings and everything that matters. So I think it's a matter of making it simple, making it graspable, and focusing away from the people to what needs to be done. That may cut down the process, and just that realization alone, I think, would save a lot of time.
And what people most often forget, it needs participation through the whole processes, because the politician is not the expert, and he won't find the right solution, but he will be blamed if it's the wrong solution. But often nobody contacts them in the middle phase of their, for example, legislation in Switzerland. You get no feedbacks at all, even if you write to stakeholders, also no feedback at all. And then towards the end, when the media interest sort of increases and some articles are published, then they come, but then that's too late in the processes. And that needs an intermediate and needs professionalism in the communication with politicians.
James, is there a danger, because I know that many of the high-profile victims of harm in the UK have very quickly developed a one-to-one relationship with the health secretary or the minister. Is there a danger, and this is perhaps a difficult idea, but is there a danger that ministers are often desperate to quieten down a crisis, and they're basically trying to get the victim on side so that they won't say any more negative things about what happened to them in the media?
Okay, so my perception is a little bit different to that. So when Joshua died back in 2008, I got a real sense of nervousness that this was a big problem at this hospital, and actually we need to keep bad news about healthcare quiet. I did get to meet Jeremy Hunt. I know him quite well now. And my genuine sense is actually that his motivation is to do the right thing. And actually, I think some of this is about courage, because actually, if you're a politician and you want to make a difference to patient safety, you might have to do things where you increase the robustness and independence of regulation, for example, and that will result actually in more problems coming to the surface and more bad news. But actually, that's the right thing to do. So I think my honest perception, actually, and we've been very lucky in the UK in that we've had a period of very clear political leadership in patient safety, and I think that's sincere and genuine. But I accept that there is a danger that that's how it might be perceived.
Thank you. Other questions and comments? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this very compelling panel. I'm Johannes Wacker. I'm a physician anesthesiologist based in Zurich. And I'm involved in patient safety. I'm chairing the Patient Safety Committee of the European Society of Anesthesiology. But I spent my real life in the OR or on the ward working as an anesthesiologist. So the question I have to this panel is, even if we would be able to have perfect communication according to the laws of communication physics, how well would that translate into an environment like mine, where we work under enormous time pressure and also distractions? So this is the two questions I would have. Even if we select the right people, if we train them well in terms of communication, as I see it, these distractions and the time pressure affect the quality of communication enormously.
Annegret, this is a very strong theme, this idea that communication is affected by the fast-moving, high-pressured environment that modern healthcare represents. What can we do about that?
Well, that's what these contexts make it so prone to failure. So, and that's what part of what we talk about in that model is contextualization. So communication is always context bound. And what we found in terms of the time question is always the question, we have little time to talk with patients and with each other, there's lots of interruptions. So I think it's very important to focus on that and to frame that communication within that context in order to overcome that barrier, right? So what we found though, and this is dependent on a study that we're now planning to do among other places in Bern and also that I run at EOT hospitals, is to measure the effect of, you know, there's different models for communication. My model of communication on the use of time, because what we've been seeing in those incident analyses that lots of time gets lost in just stabbing around in the dark and not attaining a shared understanding. So if we can structure or equip those interpersonal processes so that there's no more stabbing around in the dark, but we get to that shared understanding more quickly, we've got that time issue resolved. So that's the time part. And then also the context of these enormous pressures and many people being interacted in those rooms. I think, again, moving the focus out of those people, out of the context, onto the objective of a shared understanding and being clear about that, that's the objective of what we need to be attaining in this conversation, would help that happen. Now, that said, we will never be error-free. I think that communication skills are a line of defense, a strong line of defense that we can strengthen a lot more than we have it strong now. But in the end, we have to recognize that we're humans, things will continue to fail. But again, the promise and the potential of that is enormous, I think.
Kai, there's always a phenomenon in education, that the professional education, that the students lower down in the system, starting their courses, watch what's happening, what world they're going to go into. And I think this has been a period where there's been intense concern about the ability to practice well in an environment where you just are overwhelmed with workload and pressure. How do you prepare the students or reassure them or give them a more positive view of the future when they're worried about, you know, should I have ever started this idea of becoming a doctor or a nurse in the first place? Because
yes, as we know, the most incentive or the most powerful tool for students is the role model. They learn most at the role models, and we can educate them like hell, I say, yes. If in very intense, open-ended questions and washing their hands every time when they come into an environment where this culture is not lived by all the others, they will adapt within a couple of weeks the manners of these surroundings. So we have to educate not only the students but also the staff, the attendings, and what we are doing, we're giving trainings also in hospitals for feedback, for example, speaking up techniques. And as Annegret said, where humans work, there will be errors, yes? Humans who work are doing errors. Humans who work more, they're doing more errors. Like Homer Simpson, if you don't do anything, you can't do any mistakes. So we have to face the fact that humans will make errors, but the way is not to prevent every error, but to find the error in a very early way, in a very early time, and then to teach the staff, to educate the staff to speak up then, and that it's a climate, that it's not a problem of the individual, but it will make the whole surrounding, like in anesthesia, more safer. If everybody can say, this might be wrong. There we can learn from aviatics again. And from SIRS. Yes, it's an error reporting system, an anonymous error reporting system in anesthesiology and in the ORs. And a good chair, a head of the department, should report his mistake of the week every week for the whole staff. That would be a good role model. Every chair makes errors because they work really hard, and I don't believe that any chair of a department doesn't make any errors. But they try to have the impression that they're like a god and making no errors. But if they would come a bit down and say, last week I made this error, please look at this error, and I'm a chair, yes, my competence is out of question. I can say I made the error. And that would be a good role model.
I think that's what your very own Jeremy Hunt said in London, if I may recall, that the leadership starts with the supervisor talking about his errors to his...
Now we're coming into the last 10 minutes. I want to give the panel warning of something that they were asked to do, and just rather than springing it on them again at the end, you were asked to have a piece of advice on communication which you feel, a piece of practical advice that everyone could take away and use in their jobs. So I'll come to you last to ask you for your concise piece of advice about improving communication. But in the meantime, is there another question from the audience? Perhaps from the back, where so
Possiamo
far?
anche avere una domanda in italiano, se c'è qualcuno che non parla inglese.
Another question from the audience? Yes, here please.
One of the themes that I think is missing here is governance. The rector was heading on that point, because we need to talk about accountabilities, responsibilities, but also trust. Trust in know-how, trust in our people that do the everyday jobs. So basically what we do at EOC now, we are start to change the strategy and to talk to people and tell the people they can speak up, no problem, if they are in their own responsibility. We take them in trust because they know, they have know-how, but also we encourage them to speak and communicate horizontal and vertical. But I'm telling this because it's from the behavior of a company, of an hospital, from the governance. So, and the feedback that we have back, is, this is good, but we need to improve more the times. We need time. So in order to be able to communicate right, we need time. So, and then what we do as managers, we try to change process, to do new projects, and to empower people to speak at the same level. I give you an example. We have in Lugano, here we have Director Yelmoni. He's having a very great project now that is running the most important department, internal medicine, is heading by two people. One is a professor, of course a doctor, and the other one is the head of nurses. To put nurses and doctor on the same level in order to improve the teamwork, and I think this is something that we have to look in the future, and we have very success with young doctors because they are more able to work in teams. There is no more the one-man show, but there is more team players. So. Just to conclude, I would like to say that safe communication in healthcare, in the panel, we need to address also governance, not politician, but governance, because that is something that we can, with our behavior, confirm to along the line that everybody has his own responsibility, accountability, but his know-how is something very precious to gain trust with the patients and with the organization.
Okay. Yvonne, what does governance have to offer, do you think, changes to governance structures?
I wanted just to give a comment because we heard several words that were coming back what we said at the beginning. You need a healthy work environment. You need the culture, which takes time, but culture are systems made by people, so we have to do it. Everybody has this responsibility. It needs leadership, it needs infrastructure, because if the organization doesn't admit this, then you don't have a nurse, the doctor, etc., etc. And then the fifth thing, which we didn't, because the time is short, of course. We heard about simulation with in centers where you simulators, the patient, etc. I think there's a huge possibility for involving patients, their experiences, and the family experiences in education. We started a 3-day course, which is called Reignition the Spirit of Care. It's interprofessional, but we started only with nurses for the moment, but anyway. And the second day, we always invite patients. And they tell their stories, how they what for them was positive, how they felt comfortable, or where they felt abandoned. And it's a huge impact on everybody to hear this. And it is different if you see a movie, it's different if you do a simulation, and it's therapeutic. Also for the patients or the ex-patients themselves, because it's in a very safe context, and you explain what you felt, and everybody is learning from that. And that's something which I think is very important.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask you for your practical messages, advice. Start with you, Marco.
Okay. So even if you have perfect communication and you gathered all the information, it's always possible that you not make the right decision or not make an error.
Okay, thank you. Yvonne?
Be aware in the moments you are emotionally touched, even if whether it's positive or negative, but there you can learn most, I think.
Okay, thank you. Kai?
You learn very effective from your own errors, but you also can learn from errors others made, so share your errors. And that's for all hierarchies.
Okay. Annegret?
Never assume that communication has taken place. And if it's taken place, never assume that it has led to a shared understanding.
Thank you. James?
So in England, there's a doctor called Dr. Kate Granger, who sadly is no longer with us, and she developed a serious form of cancer and found herself becoming a patient. And what she observed actually was that none of the doctors, none of the healthcare professionals that engaged with her introduced themselves. And she started a very famous campaign in England that's incredibly simple. Hello, my name is. Okay, it's had a huge influence in healthcare. So one very simple message, taking your advice, that first step in communication, hello, my name is, and that's a good starting point.
Yvonne?
Well, I've 3 things in my mind.
Only one message?
Yes, it's one message, it's 3 sentences,
okay.
One message. What we're talking about a lot these times is listen with attention in the communication. Listen with attention, speak with intention, and be aware of the effect and the impact of your words on the others.
And my message would be always try and put yourself in the shoes of the patient, and don't be afraid of losing your objectivity. You can still see things through the patient's eyes and remain sufficiently impartial in advising them and making judgments. So we come to the end of the meeting. I'm asked to make some concluding remarks, and I really want to keep those very, very simple. I'd like to thank Annegret and her team, both of staff and students, for organizing this event. And I'd like to thank the university and the rector, not just for your support for tonight's event, but for supporting this area of work. There are very few places in the world that are doing work on communication in relation to safety of care. It's very important, and we greatly, in the wider world, we greatly appreciate the support that the University of Lugano is giving to this work. So, and thank you. You've turned up in very large numbers. You've been very patient. We have observers to make sure nobody's fallen asleep, and nobody did. So you're now welcome to join all of us for refreshments, which I think are just outside. Thank you very much for a wonderful evening of debate and discussion.